and thanks for joining this edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. It's a pleasure to welcome today a former holder of the Office of National Security Advisor of the United States. Robert C. O'Brien served as National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2021, acting as President Donald Trump's principal advisor on all aspects of American foreign policy and national security affairs. The ambassador is the co-founder and current chairman of American Global Strategies LLC, and also serves on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board in the second term. Thanks so much for joining us, Robert.
Thanks, Dan. Glad to be here.
Great. Let's jump right in terms of looking at your tenure. I know I'm interested, and certainly our members will be interested to hear of your sort of highlights and maybe lowlights of your time as National Security Advisor. In terms of the things that you, during that period, you look back on, is there anything that you feel most proud of, that you feel was a particularly good achievement, and anything that perhaps you might be disappointed by?
Well, Dan, so prior to becoming National Security Advisor, I was a Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. And that job entailed bringing Americans home, either wrongful detainees or hostages that were held by non-state actors, so JNM, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, that sort of thing. And then trying to get wrongfully detained Americans out of places as diverse as Yemen and Colombia, Venezuela, North Korea, Syria, Sweden, with a rapper named A$AP Rocky. And when I became National Security Advisor, I was able to put a little more weight behind that and weight behind the President's policy of bringing Americans home. He didn't care about their politics. He just cared, or their race. He just cared that they had a blue passport, and that some group was trying to leverage them to change U.S. policy or to get money out of us or demand the release of a prisoner, a terrorist or something, or arms dealer or something like that. So I'm very proud of the people we brought home, both in my prior position and as National Security Advisor. I think the history books will look at the Abraham Accords, the normalization of diplomatic relations between Israel and Bahrain and UAE and Morocco, Sudan, Kosovo, as being the signature foreign policy event of the first term. We talk a lot about peace through strength, and that's certainly President Trump's policy. It was President Reagan's policy. I've tried to adhere to it in my career. But too often I think we focus on the strength part of it. How many ships do we have? How many missiles do we have? How many aircraft carriers do we have? And counting them up against the other guys. And we don't focus enough on the reason we're strong, or we try and maintain our strength, is to get peace. And President Trump has been, particularly in the first and in the second term, successful in leveraging American strength to achieve peace. And so I think that's something that'll be a legacy that's maybe a little counterintuitive, but I think that's going to be his legacy as president.
And anything that you felt you would have liked to stay on to achieve?
We got some bad guys. We got Soleimani, we got Baghdadi, but there were. I would like to see the Abraham Accords expand to include Saudi and Kuwait and maybe Oman and Qatar. I think that would have been a real achievement. We started the Western Hemisphere campaign to eject the Chinese from the Panama Canal and put some American bases back in the Canal Zone, what was the Canal Zone. We tried to move our agenda in the Western Hemisphere, but COVID really interrupted that. And then, of course, the election and President Biden coming in kind of stalled that. And so it really took until the second term for the pivot to the Western Hemisphere to gain full force. And I would like to have seen some more progress in North Korea, which I think we could have had some more success. But unfortunately, during the 4-year interregnum between the first and Trump administration, North Korea drastically expanded its nuclear stockpile and its delivery systems. And so it's going to be very difficult to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, which I think would have been a major accomplishment that we didn't achieve, but we made some progress towards. So there's never enough time to do everything. It's a complicated world. It's a dangerous world out there, and we tried our best to get as many things done as we could, but time goes fast in those offices.
And one of the things I suppose that many people have observed has been how different the first term and second terms have been. I'm wondering if you see it in that way. Do you see a president who, having learned from the experiences of the first term, was better prepared for the second term, had in terms of personnel, was more prepared to take the office back? Do you see as much of a contrast between the first and second terms? And if there are contrasts, are there particular policy positions or things that have been executed differently in terms of the two terms?
Yeah, so Dan, that's a very good question, and kind of anticipated what I was going to say with respect to the pivot to the Western Hemisphere. That would be one example. In the first term, you have to realize that the president came into office, he'd been a businessman. He didn't have friends in politics. I don't think he'd ever stayed overnight in DC. He had to rely on people sometimes who didn't share his agenda, or thought they should implement their agenda, or thought they should be a guardrail to the president. And President Trump, if anything, is a quick learner. And so he had 4 years to so to speak, apprentice as president. So when he came back in the second term, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. He put in a team of people that were like-minded, that would execute his policies. And so I think maybe the biggest difference between the first and the second term is the rapidity of the policy implementation that's taken place, whether it was the tariffs on Liberation Day. President Trump's always been in favor of tariffs, but he tackled the trade agenda with robustness and vigor. Certainly the pivot to the Western Hemisphere with removing the Chinese from the Panama Canal, the operation in Venezuela to arrest Maduro, who was a major drug dealer, and giving the Venezuelan people a chance to have freedom. And I think we're going to see some real progress on that front in the next couple of weeks and months. And obviously open up the Venezuelan oil supply to the world, and removing those sanctions is a big deal. And then Greenland, which is, I know not a popular subject in Europe, and I'm very good friends with the Danes, and think highly of them as an ally. I saw them in Afghanistan fighting on our side, and they're a good ally. But we needed a situation in Greenland where we could defend ourselves. I mean, Greenland is essential to the defense of the United States, which is why we had to take it over in World War II, to protect ourselves. And if Golden Dome is going to get off the ground, our missile defense system, we need to have bases with missile interceptors in Greenland. We need to protect the island and its rare earth elements from the Chinese and the Russians. And so I think we're going to end up with a lot of leeway. We may not end up with Greenland, but we're going to end up with a lot of leeway with our basing rights. And we just don't have time with Golden Dome, for example. We don't have time if there's a missile attack on America from a rogue actor, North Korea or China or Russia, heaven forbid, to wake up the ambassador, get him to the king or the prime minister, and get permission to launch a counter strike missile. I mean, it's going to be a 3 or 5 minute window to launch interceptors to take the ICBM down. So we need to have that flexibility with Greenland, and we're seeing the Danes now, fortunately, put a lot of money into the defense of Greenland, put a frigate in Greenland, put Danish soldiers in Greenland to defend the sovereignty of Greenland. So I think it's been very successful, although it was a little bit, the diplomacy was a little unorthodox, I'll admit.
Because it certainly was something that shocked Europe in terms of a demand for sovereign territory that I suppose most people, even those who might support the current U.S. president, felt there were better ways to achieve that objective in terms of guaranteeing American security, while at the same time not making such a kind of shocking demand as seeking the sovereignty of the island.
Well, you're right, Dan, but if you know President Trump, I mean, he makes, and anyone who's read The Art of the Deal, he makes maximalist demands. And by the way, President Truman wanted to buy Greenland. It's not a new idea. President Truman wanted to buy it. President Eisenhower wanted to buy it. So it's not out of left field. And Americans certainly occupy Greenland to protect the Danish in Greenland and to protect America in the past. So it's not outlandish, but I envision, and we'll see how the negotiations go. I hear they're going quite well between the Danes and the U.S. Something along the lines of the British bases in Cyprus.
Okay.
Where there's sovereignty over the bases, and that will allow the U.S. to protect America, but maybe Denmark or the Greenlanders themselves exercise their own sovereignty over their own cities and territory. But the bases will be, if it's not called sovereignty, it'll be something akin to that.
Okay, interesting. I hadn't heard the Cyprus model being put forward. In terms of, you mentioned your experience with hostages in the past. You've also had a lot of experience at the UN during your career. I'm wondering, to start with the sort of multilateral picture, how do you assess how multilateral institutions such as the UN have evolved over the decades? And I ask that both from just your global perspective and also in terms how they help or how they might hinder increasingly or decreasingly the US to pursue its interests in the world.
Yeah, so I've got a little bit of an interesting background with the UN that's kind of intersected my entire career. I started kind of my diplomatic career as a international civil servant working for the Secretariat in Geneva. And so I was actually, I received a UN paycheck, and so I was working at the UN Compensation Commission, handling claims against Iraq arising out of the first Gulf War. And so I saw it from the inside for several years, and then I returned a decade later as one of President Bush's representatives at the UN. And what I tell people, look, the UN is very bureaucratic. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of corruption at the UN. Which is unfortunate. We've seen the UN in large part because of the vetoes at the Security Council. I mean, of course, we think our veto is great, but we don't like the Russian and Chinese veto. We've seen a lot of initiatives stall out of the UN. And so there's a general feeling, especially among conservatives in America, that the UN isn't efficacious and we should get rid of it. I disagree with that. I agree that the UN suffers from corruption and the lack of the ability to get things done. But if you didn't have a UN, you'd have to invent a UN. I mean, there has to be a place where smaller countries can come together and have their kind of what I'll call their day in court, where they can get up during the UN General Assembly and talk about water and cotton and crops and their own civil wars and bring to the world's attention things that, we don't normally hear about what's going on in Mali or Equatorial Guinea or even South Africa or some parts of Asia. And for these countries to have their leaders come to the UN and come to New York and tell the world what they're facing, it's important to have that forum, even if it's just to be a forum. But I think, I think there are reforms that can be made at the UN. We've recommended them over the past, and have the donations to the UN be voluntary, so the countries can direct their donations to programs that are working, and that'll encourage less corruption and there are a whole number of things that we did. We had a group called JUICE, Japan, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, that I think the UK was part of that as well, that focused on these UN reforms. I think Mike Waltz, our UN ambassador, has done a good job. The budget's being rationalized, and I think there's less waste, fraud, and abuse. I think one of the major problems at hand is that the Chinese Communist Party has seen the UN as a tool that it can use to undermine the global rules-based international order to the extent that still exists, or to use the UN as a tool for its foreign policy. And so one of the things that the Chinese have done, and the Russians and the Iranians to some extent, they've paid for interns to go to the UN. And they've focused on the human resources department. They focused on the legal department, and so by taking over those mechanisms within the UN, they can root out whistleblowers. They can have a disproportionate influence, and they've also tried to use their Belts and Roads initiative to buy votes to the UN to put Chinese or people who are lenient towards or tolerant of the Communist Party of China into key positions in the specialized agencies. And so, we saw that with the WHO in the pandemic, in the coronavirus pandemic. So I think if the free world wants to see the UN succeed, we really need to work together. We need to roll up our sleeves and make sure that it's not being infiltrated and subverted by the communists.
And I also worked for the UN in Geneva, for one of the agencies, for a period of time. And I think anybody who worked there would agree that some of the agencies may not be invented if they didn't exist. But I suppose the counter argument from an American perspective is that if you pull out of the WHO, that you effectively clear the field for those countries that you would view as adversaries, and that even if you don't like them and you feel that it's a waste of money, that not being there actually reduces your influence and increases the influence of countries that you may not want to increase influence. What do you make of that argument?
Yeah, I generally agree with that argument. It goes to the location of the headquarters as well. As you know, the UN is headquartered in New York, and it could use some refurbishing, but the fact that the world has to come to New York, I think is in the U.S. interest. Again, it's controversial to have all these, you have the tin pot dictators and the genocidaires and the Holocaust deniers and the really bad, basically terrorists when you get the Iranian diplomats coming. It's kind of frustrating to see them on the streets of New York and going to the shops and, buying the shop, buying out the inventory of Chanel and Gucci and stores like that with the ill-gotten gains that they've got been bribed by the Chinese or they've taken from their own citizens. But I think we're better off having the UN in New York and being a member of it and having some measure of control over it than having it in Bangkok and not being part of it.
Another sort of global, bigger picture question from an American perspective, from somebody who's been national security advisor, seen all the intelligence, and as you're still connected to this administration. What do you view as being the biggest threats to the United States going forward?
So Dan, I'd like to take that in two pieces if I could. I think and I'll talk about this in a moment, I think the long-term existential threat, the threat that could change how we live, how our kids and grandkids live, and actually our Irish kids and your grandkids are going to live, is a challenge from the Communist Party of China. We've never seen an existential threat like this in the West. Far greater and bigger than the Soviet threat, bigger than the German threat in World War II. It's a very serious issue. I'll talk about that. But we've got these intermediate or kind of initial threats that we face. There's still jihadists out here. I mean, we see and with the mass immigration into the U.S. and into Europe, We've got people who are being self-radicalized or radicalizing themselves on the internet. They don't have to have a big cell. They can just go out with a machete and maim and kill people. That's a real issue. We have to be alert to global jihadism. Number one. Number two, we've got the Ukraine situation. We've got a major European power, Russia, trying to change the borders of Europe by force, really for the first time since 1938. I mean, we haven't seen this before, and the amount of death and destruction and killing that's taking place in Ukraine is heartbreaking and horrifying at the same time to see these bombings of civilians in Kiev. It's really a terrible thing. And it's, look, there's a potential the Russians could try to do the same thing to Poland or to the Baltic states. And so that's a major issue. And today we're dealing with a situation in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz that the U.S. is dealing with basically alone, trying to stop the Iranians from obtaining a nuclear weapon and stop them from financing their terrorist proxies that launched the worst genocide against Israel on October 7th, Hamas, with the support of Hezbollah and Iran that we've seen since World War II, since the Gestapo and the German troops would follow the Wehrmacht into parts of Poland and liquidate the Jews. That's basically what happened on October 7th, and that hasn't gotten the attention that I think it deserves in Europe. But we're literally trying to save Israel, save America, and save Europe, because if the Iranians get a nuke, and they probably don't have ballistic missiles that can reach the U.S. yet, but they certainly do that can reach Europe or get close to reaching Europe. So this fight is important. I think it'll be resolved soon. I think there'll be I think the Iranians will come to their senses and negotiate a good deal, but we'll have to see. The missile strikes in Jordan yesterday didn't help, but President Trump would like to do a deal with the Iranians and like to have a deal that ends their nuclear program for starters, and hopefully we'll get there.
A lot of issues, a lot of ground covered there. Maybe could I come back to the first point about China? And interesting that you feel that it's a bigger threat than the Soviet Union. And presumably, you feel that's on the basis of its sheer size economically and by population.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, 1.2 billion people. An economy that is almost as big as the United States economy. It's the second biggest economy in the world, and integrated into the world economy. I mean, this is an isolated economy like the Russian economy was during the Cold War, and they're also motivated by communism. Vladimir Putin says that the worst geopolitical nightmare of his lifetime, the greatest failure, was the loss of the Soviet Empire. The Chinese feel the same way. They feel that the demise of the Communist Party in Russia was a terrible thing. They do not intend to have the same thing happen in China. They intend to maintain Communist Party rule. And if it was just China, that wouldn't be okay, because of the lack of human rights for the Chinese people, for the Uyghurs, for minorities, for non-communists in China. But the fact is that they're trying to export their ideology and conquer territory. So we've got them in the Senkaku Islands in the Sea of Japan. We've got them in the LOC. We have them in the entire South China Sea, from the Philippines all the way around to all the ASEAN countries, building islands and taking over exclusive economic zone sea territory of those countries, especially the Philippines. And then, of course, we've got the problem in Taiwan with, the Taiwanese are basically surrounded on a daily basis by the Chinese Coast Guard and Navy and Blue Militia, its trawlers. The Chinese Coast Guard is now hailing vessels en route to Taiwan, asking what's on them, and exercising police power over the trade that's going into Taiwan. And an invasion or coercive, takeover of Taiwan would be it could be horrific because we've seen what the Chinese have done to the Uyghurs. We've seen what they've done to the Jimmy Lai and the protesters in Hong Kong. We've seen what they did in Tiananmen Square. There are 6 million people in Taiwan at least that support the DPP, that have called for independence, that have called for democracy. And under Chinese Communist Party doctrine, those 6 million are traitors, and they need to be liquidated. They need to be either re-educated in camps, they need to be put in prison for life, or they need to be killed. We haven't seen something like this since World War II. I mean, this is like Auschwitz on steroids. And to believe that the Chinese would do anything, would be like the South Africans and have a mass pardon or reconciliation commission or Venezuela. That's not the Chinese character, the Communist Party character. So it's a very dangerous situation, just from a human rights position, but then also with AI and quantum computing. Taiwan controls 90% of the advanced manufacturers, 90% of the advanced chips that the world uses, the world economy uses. So if the Chinese get a hold of TSMC intact, they'll have a grip on the world economy far greater than OPEC ever did. And that's we'd all be at their mercy. And it would take years to break out of that monopoly. So the more likely scenario is that the Taiwanese destroy the TSMC plants in the ecosystem, or America does to keep it out of Chinese communist hands. And then we're looking at a recession that could, I heard Scott Besson recently say it's estimated that we'd see a 7% decline in the global economy, and he thinks that's too conservative. He thinks it'll be far more than that. So the U.S. believes in the status quo. We have not recognized Taiwan as an independent country. We're not advocating for that. We're advocating for the status quo. It's Xi Jinping and the Chinese that are trying to change the status quo, that are trying to coercively incorporate Taiwan, or through the threats or actual violence. And that's something that the entire Western world, in fact, the entire world, whether East or West, should be opposed to that. And we should, stand up for the status quo. This has nothing to do with the one China policy or that sort of thing, but it's the people of Taiwan should be able to choose for themselves what they want to do.
And tell me, Robert, do you think there's any possibility that there could be a grand bargain struck between the U.S. and China, that the U.S. would cede East Asia, including Taiwan, and say, look, that's your part of the world, and you stay out of the Western Hemisphere and pull back? Do you see any possibility that the president might consider such a deal?
I in all my interactions with them, that's never come up. That's kind of not an American policy. To cede territory, to cede space, we don't do that. We don't take space either. Unlike many other powers that have had our leverage and the military might, we haven't taken a colony. The only thing we've asked for from any country is a place to bury our dead, a cemetery, and we've left, or we maybe left some soldiers behind to defend those countries. But we didn't take Japan, we didn't take Germany. We didn't take any of the countries that we could have. We're not interested in that, but we're not interested in other countries doing that either. We don't want Russia to take Ukraine. We don't want China to take Taiwan. We want the people of those territories and those countries to decide for themselves what their future is, and let them have aspirations, for life, liberty, and happiness that they can pursue, and that also we can have free and fair trade with those countries, and not be dictated to by a communist party that's intent on seizing all of the 5G and seizing chip making and seizing advantages that Xi Jinping has said in the China 2025 document, that they want to lead every major technological area. And they'll do whatever it takes, whether it's the IP theft or unfair trade practices, dumping, or non-tariff barriers, to achieve it. And that's not fair to workers in America, and frankly, it's not fair to workers in Ireland or Europe either.
So what you're saying, I very much get the sense that you feel this is Cold War 2.0, possibly even worse, given that you mentioned that you think China is fundamentally more powerful than the Soviets ever were. So have we really just returned to a Cold War era?
So I don't think we've returned into a Cold War era yet. President Trump is trying to get along with Xi Jinping. He respects him. They got a very cordial personal relationship, and we can trade with China. I mean, as long as it's not military, or weapon systems or dual use systems that we give the Chinese an advantage, but. There's no reason we can't trade with China. We can't get along with China, but China has to treat us fairly, and in turn we'll treat them fairly. And I think we can get through this thing. But taking your neighbors on and trying to conquer your neighbors and engaging in unfair trade practices is not helpful. So. I think both sides can avoid a Cold War and certainly a hot war, which would be truly a horrific event. A hot war between nuclear powers would be something we want to avoid at every cost that we can. And I certainly, as National Security Advisor, when I left my condo in the morning, I'd say a quick prayer to God help me keep the U.S. safe, and one of the key things there is avoiding any kind of conflict with a nuclear power that could escalate, because Russia, China, the U.S. engaged in a nuclear exchange would be devastating. So I don't think we're ever going to go there. I hope not, but we can. There's no reason we can't get along with the Russians and the Chinese, but. Their belligerent and aggressive behavior towards their neighbors isn't helpful.
Moving closer to home, from our perspective at least, is the U.S. attitude towards a unified Europe and European integration. Since the Second World War, near every administration has supported the idea of European integration on the basis that it was good for America. A stronger Europe was a stronger ally. I'm wondering, the national security strategy was published late last year, took a very different position and frankly shocked a lot of Europeans in the position that it took. It viewed more that it was in America's interests not to have an integrated Europe and to have individual European countries acting alone, which some people interpreted on this side of the Atlantic as a divide and rule position, very different from all previous post-war administrations. I'd like to get your interpretation of how the administration thinks about Europe and European integration in particular.
Well, look, the main issue we have is we want a Europe that reflects Western values, a Europe that's Europe. We want a Europe that's capable, that can help the United States in the defense of Ukraine, the defense of Taiwan, the Strait of Hormuz. These Western important Western goals and objectives. We want a Europe that can help us with that. That's strong, that's capable, and that reflects Western values. Unfortunately, some of the bureaucrats in Brussels have with their limits on speech, with their unfair trade practices with the U.S., with the attacks on U.S. tech companies. We think it's been less than helpful. But look, for many of us, our parents, our grandparents, and our great-grandparents came from Europe, and especially with a nation like Ireland, the bonds are very strong. Even if you never visited the country, you know you're Irish, and people know they're German, they know they're Italian. Those bonds and ties to Europe are extraordinarily strong in the United States. We love Europe, and certainly the Irish here love Ireland, and so I think if the European people want to integrate further, that's fine. But we need to have Europe pay for our defense. We need to have a Europe that believes in deterrence to deter the Russians. I mean, we're not sitting with the Russians on our doorstep; the Europeans are. We need a Europe that believes in the West. I mean, the Irish saved Western civilization. What did they save it for? What did the monks translate all those Greek and Latin documents for. It's and research. It's to maintain our beliefs and our values and our strength comes from that. And so we want a strong Europe. We want a Europe without censorship, without denying free speech. Because what's the point if we have a woke Europe that's enforcing speech codes the way the Soviets did? What's the point of spending so much money and effort and blood and treasure to try and defend Europe and the West if the West is basically surrendered? So I think most Americans are for a strong, capable Europe that burden shares and that believes in Western values. And if the people of Europe want to put more power in Brussels, God bless them. But let's just make sure Brussels reflects the values of the people and is democratic and not autocratic.
You mentioned Europeans paying for their own defence, and of course that has been, certainly as long as I've been in this business, that has been always been a call that Americans have felt that Europeans weren't doing enough for their own defence. But in the final few minutes, maybe we just focus on some views you might have on Ireland. You wrote what some people might call a tough love op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last year, and one of the criticisms you made of Ireland was its free riding. For those who haven't read the article, or maybe those who have and would like to hear more, you might just elaborate on how you and Republican circles view Ireland. Obviously, a relatively small country. We're not in NATO, but just in that issue around defence and what Ireland should be doing. A few thoughts on that?
Sure, Dan. And let me start by saying, maybe other than Israel, there's no other country in the world that has the support and the affection that Ireland has in the United States. I mean, the St. Patrick's Day celebrations are enormous, not just of people of Irish descent, but of almost the entire country. We have Irish politicians come here and they're received by the President of the White House, and by the Speaker of the House, and the majority of the Senate. I mean, Ireland has a huge base of support in America because so many of us are from Ireland, and we're starved out at one point or the other, and had to come over, or wanted the adventure and the wide open country to come try their luck and try and make their fortune here. And so there's a real love for Ireland. What we've seen though is there's no one has a problem with Irish neutrality. I mean, the Finns were neutral, the Swedes were neutral, the Swiss are neutral still. If Ireland wants to be neutral, that's fine, but neutrality doesn't mean pacifism. And I kind of think one of my favorite films of the last decade has been The Siege of Judaville. And to see how brave and how courageously the Irish fought in that instance. And in our history, to see how brave the Irish were in taking on that little island to the east. So Ireland's got a great martial tradition, and so it can be neutral, but it shouldn't be a pacifist. And I'm really glad to see that the Irish are starting to invest more in defense. The drone program is great. The new helicopters are great. But you have to think that the Chinese, with one frigate, could enforce a boycott of Ireland. If it wasn't for the Royal Navy, which is sadly a shadow of its former self, the U.S. Navy, which is spread very, very thin, Ireland could be blockaded by a single Chinese frigate sailing up from Angola or Namibia, where they will have a base in the next few years. They'll have a base on the Atlantic. And Ireland can't do anything to defend itself. It has no jet aircraft, it has no frigates, it has no navy, so to speak. So, look, I believe just for not to be part of NATO or not to engage in military action on behalf of the U.S. or with the U.S. as a partner, but just to defend itself, Ireland needs the military, and it needs a naval service, and it needs an air force. And gone are the days of Irish poverty and the days where everyone had to immigrate to have a chance. Ireland's become a very prosperous and advanced country, a very modern country, and it can afford a small modern military paid for by 2 or 5% of its GDP. And that'll inure to the benefit of Ireland. If eventually it wanted to join NATO, that'd be, in my view, great. But just to protect itself and to avoid a boycott or a blockade by the Chinese, it should have some military expertise. And like the Russians aren't far away either. I mean, just to your north, and they've shown a propensity to cut cables, to engage in espionage, to engage in political assassination in the British Isles. I mean, we've seen how brutal their invasion and occupation of Ukraine has been. So I think Ireland has to. It's fine to depend on the U.S. and I think we'll be there for Ireland, but we need to have some burden sharing. Just like we have burden sharing with NATO, we have to have some burden sharing with a neutral Ireland, so that if something does happen, the balloon goes up, that we're there and we can work together to defend Ireland.
In that piece, you also very specifically warned against courting Chinese investment. I was interested to know what your concerns are around that. Is it because you feel that Chinese companies will do the bidding of Beijing? Is it because you feel that in this new environment, allies have to choose? And that riding both horses is not possible, and that America is within its rights to insist that its allies do not deal too closely with China. Just interested in your thinking around that warning.
Sure, Dan. The big issue is Chinese espionage. That's the number one issue, and that's hoovering up all of our economic data, our personal data, our medical records, every one of our emails, and that happens, especially with Huawei, with 5G. Every conversation you have, it's not a Huawei phone, it's going up to a cloud in Beijing. And even if a Chinese company is just run by ordinary Chinese people under their national security law, every country in China is subordinate to the party and has to do the party's bidding. So, I mean, so number one is the espionage. Number two is the economic impact of their unfair trade practices, whether it's IP theft, and we have great American companies, doing a lot of pharmaceutical work, a lot of electronics work, a lot of silicon chip work in Ireland, software development, and so we need to make sure that the Chinese don't steal that property, intellectual property, and put our companies out of business and grow their companies as a result. Number three is the national security impact. Is if you have BYD cars, Israel has banned Chinese electric vehicles from its military bases, and is thinking about banning them from other jurisdictions. We don't have Chinese cars here, but every one of those cars think of as a sensor, as a platform for Chinese espionage. But also they could be kinetically used if there was a war situation in Taiwan or Ireland decided to oppose China for any reason. Those cars could be weaponized and driven into government buildings, run down civilians, not work. So there's a whole panoply of reasons to be concerned about the Chinese. But I'm not advocating that there's not trade with the Chinese, and that for non-national security items, that the Chinese shouldn't be invited in to build factories and that sort of thing. But just be careful of the dual use and Chinese economic and national security espionage and the potential for sabotage.
We've hit the 45 minutes, but just one question, and if you want to just give this a yes, no. You were also critical of Ireland's position on Israel, Palestine in that article. You may have seen that in the past week, legislation has been passed here to ban the importation of goods from the occupied territories. Now, a few dozen American politicians have previously warned that could have consequences for Ireland in terms of our relations with the United States. Do you think that could have blowback?
Yes, and I'm waiting to see the similar legislation regarding China based on their actual genocide of the Uyghurs. It sounds like a pretty big double standard to me.
Ambassador.
And legislation against the Arabs for having taken Jews out of the entire Middle East and shoved them into Israel or Europe. So, I hope it's not just rank anti-Semitism, because I don't feel that way. I don't think most Irish people feel that way about the Jewish people. We've got a lot of similarities between us, and a lot of kind of shared history, and it's unfortunate. It's perfectly legitimate to want a two-party, two-state solution, or a peace treaty between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It's perfectly reasonable not to support expanded settlements, and I get all that. But the idea that Israel's being punished, a plucky little country in a very difficult neighborhood is being punished in a way that no other country is being punished by Ireland. It's not a good look for Ireland, and I don't think Americans will like it. I don't think people around the world will like it.
Ambassador O'Brien, you've been very generous with your time. We appreciate it very much. We've covered an awful lot of ground. So thanks so much again, and wishing you and your staff a good day.